They said her skin never aged. They said time could not touch her, that in a court of rotting men and crumbling thrones she remained luminous, flawless, ageless, unchanging, a portrait that defied the painter's brush, a myth standing in a world too fragile to hold it. But that was the illusion, and illusions, no matter how regal, are built on pain. Behind the veil of silk and alchemy, behind the perfumes that masked decay, there was something else, the quiet, ritualistic violence of a woman who had declared war on death, and on herself. Her palace was a mausoleum of beauty, pillars of ivory, windows carved like lace, gardens that bloomed year-round despite the dying soil, and at its center, her chambers, lit always by candles, never by sun, draped in velvet, never in light. It was there that the syringes were kept. Delicate glass instruments wrapped in cloth of gold, locked inside a cabinet that only she could open. Their contents? A shimmering solution, thick as honey, radiant as flame. Gold. Melted, alchemized, refined, turned into liquid and drawn into veins that once pulsed with youth, and now pulsed only with defiance. She told no one what it cost. Not the servants who washed her linen stained with blood and light. Not the physicians who whispered of mercury and madness. Not even the gods she no longer prayed to. Because gods, unlike gold, ask questions, and gold only obeys. She began small, a drop beneath the skin, just enough to slow the lines at the corner of her mouth, just enough to keep the illusion intact. But illusions are greedy, and once they begin to crumble, they scream. So she silenced them. Every week more, every month deeper, until the mirror itself became confused, until it began to reflect not a woman, but something closer to a sculpture, perfect, polished, preserved, and utterly inhuman. But beauty, when it resists time, becomes something else entirely. It becomes horror. And yet no one dared say it. Not the council, not her lovers, not the alchemists she paid in blood and silence. They bowed, they praised, they wrote poetry in her name. They built statues that could not capture what she had become, because what she had become was not art. It was vengeance. She had watched her mother rot from within, watched the men of court trade in younger faces, as if age were a disease. She had seen the way they looked at her the moment her skin lost its first sheen of girlhood, and she decided she would never lose it again, even if it meant giving herself to gold, even if it meant bleeding from the inside, even if it meant waking each morning with fire in her veins and frost in her chest. Because to her, youth was not just beauty, it was power, it was relevance, it was a life, and she would not surrender it. Not to time, not to nature, not to God, not even to death. They called her the Gilded Queen, a title whispered in courts far from her own, a name that sounded like honor but carried the weight of fear, because something in her gaze had changed. Where once there was softness, now there was glass. Where once there was laughter, now perfect stillness. Not silence, stillness. The kind that makes even silence feel loud. The kind that suggests the body might still be alive, but the soul has stepped out of the room. They said she no longer slept. That she rested out only in brief, flickering hours. That she lay in bed without moving, her eyes wide open, hands folded, as if waiting to rise again in a world where decay could not reach her. They said the gold had touched her heart. That it beat slower now, heavier, as if each pump cost something irretrievable. But still she smiled. Still she appeared, draped in gowns of starlight, her skin glowing under chandeliers, her presence so overwhelming that men forgot what fear felt like, until they were alone and remembered. Because something about her was wrong. Not grotesque, not monstrous, just impossible. She was the answer to a question no one dared ask. What happens when a woman refuses to be consumed? And the answer was simple. She becomes the thing that consumes instead. Not others, herself. Because the gold did not give her life. It replaced it, bit by bit, cell by cell. Until the veins that once carried blood now glittered with something colder. Until the warmth that once made her human had been traded for a luster the world mistook for divine. But divinity is cruel, and she had become its priestess. Alone, untouchable, forever young, and forever dying. There were no clocks in her chambers. No hourglasses, no sundials, no bells to mark the slow bleed of time. Only silence. Because time was her enemy, and enemies were not invited into her sanctum. She had banished the morning, draped her windows in velvet thick enough to drown the sun, She told her attendants to whisper, to walk barefoot, to carry mirrors only when summoned. Even candles were trimmed short, lest they burn too quickly, lest they remind her that even wax is mortal. And yet, time still came, not in sound, in sensation, in the aching joints, in the faint tremor before sleep, in the way her hands, though flawless, began to forget the weight of things, the texture of warmth, the softness of another's skin. The gold kept her skin taut, her cheeks high, her lips full, but inside she was losing the ability to feel the world she ruled. And she knew it. That was the cruelty of her success. She had beaten time, yes, but only on the surface. Beneath the lacquered skin and radiant eyes, her body had become a battlefield of contradictions. Youthful on the outside, but rotting, pulsing with foreign metal and failing marrow within. It wasn't that she feared death. She feared becoming invisible. A woman past youth was a woman fading in the eyes of her court. She had seen it before. Queens turned ghosts in their own halls, spoken of in past tense while still alive, adored in youth and discarded in grace. She would not allow it. She refused to be remembered. She demanded to remain seen. And for that, she needed more gold. The alchemists warned her, in their careful, reverent tones, that the injections were reaching the heart, that her lungs were beginning to reject breath as if it were foreign, that her organs no longer recognized themselves. She nodded, and told them to make the gold purer. They obeyed. Because how do you deny a goddess? They called it devotion. But it was fear. Fear of her eyes. Too clear, too still, too knowing. Eyes that had not blinked in a minute, a breath, a century. Eyes that had stared too long into mirrors and now carried the weight of their reflection. She did not age. She did not decay. But neither did she live, and that unsettled them. Because deep down they all knew, death is not the opposite of life. It's a part of it, something that gives meaning to the kiss, the song, the sigh. But she had carved that meaning out, removed the end, erased the finale, and without it the music of her life became a single, endless, perfect note, unbearable. Some whispered that her laughter was gone, that she had not truly laughed in years, that her smiles were rehearsed, empty, precise, movements of the mouth without movement of the soul. Because gold does not laugh. It glows, it blinds, but it does not warm. And the queen had become like gold, not beloved, worshipped, feared. Feared not for her cruelty, and she was not cruel, but for the silence around her, the sense that in her presence the world held its breath, that in her gaze people remembered their own decay, that in her perfection they saw their own failures. She became the mirror they all avoided, not because of what she was, because of what she revealed. That youth had become a cage, and she had locked herself inside. Some said she never touched anyone, not even the handmaidens who dressed her, that even her lovers, few and fleeting, were kept at a distance, that she allowed no skin to meet hers, that warmth was an intrusion, that she feared fingerprints more than assassination, because perfection cannot be touched. It can only be admired, and so they admired her. From afar, they wrote poems about her stillness, painted portraits with no shadows, sculpted her figure in marble, though the marble seemed somehow softer than she was. And still, she was not satisfied, because immortality, once bought, demands rent. And the rent is meaning. With every day that passed without a wrinkle, she lost something else. A memory, a taste, a sound. She forgot the name of the woman who raised her. She forgot the scent of the garden she once played in. She forgot the feeling of being tired without being afraid of what it meant. She forgot herself. And in forgetting she became legend. A woman of light and silence. A queen with veins of gold and a heart of glass. But legends are lonely, and she, despite her court, her gowns, her symphonies, was the loneliest being in her kingdom. One day a child wandered into her chamber. A servant's daughter, lost in the endless corridors. The guards panicked, but the queen raised a hand. "Let her come," she said. The girl entered, barefoot, curious, unafraid. She stared at the queen, and the queen, for the first time in years, did not know how to look back. The girl reached out, touched her hand, and whispered, "You feel cold." The queen smiled, not the smile of statues, a real smile, a painful one. Because the girl was right. She was cold, cold all the way through, and in that moment, for the first time in decades, the queen felt something. Not beauty, not power, not fear. Grief. Grief for the woman she could have been. For the body she had traded. For the warmth she had banished. For the time she had tried to destroy. And in doing so, had destroyed herself. She dismissed the child. Not out of anger. Out of protection. Because now, more than ever, she understood. Gold does not forgive, and it does not let go. She had made herself eternal, and now eternity had become her tomb. Still alive, but no longer living. At night, when the halls grew still and even the moon dared not touch her windows, she would walk barefoot across the marble floor. Not like a queen, like a shadow. The air around her was too still, too careful. The scent of roses lingered not from nature but from glass vials, sprayed hourly to mask the chemical trace of what pulsed inside her. The guards outside her door rotated in silence, each shift colder than the last, none daring to ask how much of her remained real. She no longer bled. The surgeons had noticed it first. During one of the many quiet procedures she never named, one of them cut too deeply. But there was no red, only a strange metallic glimmer that oozed slowly, then stopped without clotting. They thought it was alchemical residue. They were wrong. It was her. She had become an alloy. Part woman, part myth, part ruin. The records would never say it, of course. The scribes wrote of her in pastels and gold ink. They wrote that her skin shimmered like moonlit silk, that her gaze quieted storms, that her every movement carried divine purpose. But the truth was quieter, and infinitely more painful. She was becoming invisible, not in the way she feared, not to others, to herself. Her reflection still obeyed, but it did so like a prisoner. It mimicked rather than mirrored. Her face smiled, but her heart did not. Her eyes widened, but no wonder lived behind them. It was like watching a mask learn to breathe. And the gold! Oh, the gold! It had stopped being medicine long ago. Now it was ritual. She took it not to prevent age, but to punish the thought of it. Not to extend her life, but to muffle the screams of time's approach. She welcomed the burning in her veins. It was proof she was still in control, that her throne, her legacy, her identity would not be defined by decay. But power bought this way does not come free. It comes hungry, and the hunger had begun to spread. First to her court, then to her people. They watched her glowing skin, her rigid stillness, her perfection carved from agony, and they wanted it. Not the pain, not the price, just the illusion. And so began the quiet epidemic. Golden tinctures sold in shadowed apothecaries, powdered mixtures smuggled from dying alchemists, forbidden elixirs passed hand to hand like whispered prayers. They drank her myth, and in doing so they poisoned themselves. The first to die was a nobleman's wife. She tried to replicate the formula, poured molten gold into wine. Her body seized within hours. The next was a courtesan who injected a derivative serum into her lips. They turned to stone. She suffocated before she could scream. And still, they kept trying, because the queen had proven something horrifying. Youth was no longer a gift, it was a currency. And death? Death was simply the tax collected on those who couldn't afford it. Whispers began to grow. Not against her. Never that. No one spoke ill of the divine. But around her, about her, behind gloved hands and beneath silk veils, rumors that she no longer spoke in sleep, that she did not dream, that her body was slowly rejecting breath like it rejected time. One rumor cut deepest, that she had outlived her soul. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be honest. Because what does it mean to remain beautiful when beauty no longer stirs you? What does it mean to preserve the body when it becomes a tomb for a mind that remembers nothing but silence? She began to forget things. First names, then rooms, then why she had entered them. Her advisors adjusted. They kept her schedule tight, her meetings brief, her answers prepared. She nodded when she was expected to, smiled on cue, gave orders written by others. The court bowed more deeply than ever, not out of respect, out of reverence for the monument she had become. But inside her something began to scream, not a voice, a crack. It began behind her ribs, a feeling that something was splitting from the inside. At first she thought it was panic, but panic needs breath, and hers had become shallow, calculated, rationed like a resource. It wasn't fear. It was memory, not a memory of a moment. A memory of being human. The girl from the hall returned in her dreams. Only this time older, wiser, no longer innocent. She stood before the queen in shadow and whispered, "You were never meant to last this long." And the queen, unmoving in sleep, perfect as ever, felt herself shiver, not from cold, from recognition, because there, in that whispered truth, was the one thing gold could never erase. Regret. It came slowly at first, like a morning frost creeping over a blade. She began to leave her chambers. She began to walk among her people. Veiled, yes, guarded always, but present. And what she saw did not delight her. It terrified her. Shops selling beauty had drawn from her face. Girls no older than 10 injected with glittering tonics. Men slicing their cheeks to emulate the tightness of her sculpted jaw. Children bowing not out of awe, but because they were taught that to age was shameful, that to change was sin. She had not preserved herself. She had cursed them all. The myth of her youth had become a weapon, and they were all bleeding from it. One night she stood before her mirror, unveiled, unarmored, alone. And for the first time in decades she allowed the light to fall on her completely. No shadows, no angles, just truth. She was still beautiful, but not alive. Still flawless, but not herself. Her face had become a mask carved by fear, maintained by poison, worshipped by those who did not see the grave beneath it. She raised the syringe, the last vial, the purest gold, and stared, not at the tool, at her arm, at the vein that had carried too much and asked too little, at the body she had sacrificed in the name of a war she could never win. She did not cry. There were no tears left in her. Only this thought: I wanted to be eternal, and now I am. And eternity was cold. She did not die, and yet the world began to mourn her. Not in eulogies, not in weeping processions or chiseled stone. No bells tolled in the streets, no doves released from palace balconies, but the grief was there, quiet, collective, and curiously unspoken. It clung to the court like perfume that would not fade. It sat in the corners of mirrors. It lingered in the silence that followed her entrance, a kind of mourning reserved not for the dead, but for the no longer living. She had become that rarest of creatures, a breathing elegy. People still bowed, but they bowed with the careful reverence one gives to a statue that might crack if looked at too long. Her movements were perfect, flawless in execution, empty in origin. It wasn't that she didn't care. It was that the act of caring had been smothered by something heavier, denser, metallic. She no longer tasted food, no longer asked for music, no longer touched the silk she wore. She existed in a realm of form without feeling, presence without participation, and the court, though loyal, though terrified, began to whisper a new word behind closed doors: hollow. The queen is hollow, they said. She shines, but she does not glow. She breathes, but not deeply. She lives, but only as a refusal to die. Even the children felt it. They would stare at her with wide, unblinking eyes, drawn to the brightness, repelled by the cold. She would smile carefully, beautifully, and they would instinctively step back, as if their instincts had learned something the adults refused to accept, that she was no longer safe. Not dangerous in the way of tyrants or madwomen, but dangerous in a quieter way, like a still lake hiding 100 bodies beneath its surface. She was the answer to a question no one should have asked. She was what happens when someone wins the war against nature, and discovers there's no prize. Inside her, time had stopped, but outside it raced. The world changed. Wars came and went. Empires collapsed and reformed. Languages shifted, paintings cracked, lovers aged, and she watched, and the watching broke her. Not all at once. It began with the curtains. She ordered them opened. The first sunbeam that touched her skin felt like acid, not in pain, in meaning. It reminded her of the life she had sealed away, the years spent hiding from this light, the decades spent in gold-lit mimicry while the real warmth sat waiting just beyond velvet and fear. Then came the flowers. She ordered them not to be arranged, not to be scented or sculpted, just brought in from the dirt, earth still clinging to their roots, sun-wilted, imperfect, real. The palace trembled, not from disobedience, from uncertainty, because the queen had never asked for real things, only beautiful ones, only preserved ones. But now she craved what she had once silenced: decay, not to embrace it, to understand it. She walked barefoot in the gardens, not the ceremonial ones, the wild ones beyond the marble walls, where vines cracked stone and bees swarmed without invitation. She stood in the rain, face lifted, arms at her side, feeling water on skin for the first time in half a century. And when the gold inside her reacted, when her breath caught, when her fingers trembled, she did not retreat. She welcomed it. The body she had betrayed was remembering itself, and it began to rebel. She bled again, slowly, not crimson, not pure, but something in between. The veins in her arms darkened, the glitter in her eyes dimmed. The gold, so carefully administered for so long, was beginning to lose its grip, or rather she was loosening hers. And with that loosening came memory. Not images, not moments, feelings. She remembered what it meant to shiver, not from cold, but from fear. She remembered the hunger in her stomach as a child when her mother went without food so she could eat. She remembered her first kiss, how clumsy it was, how human. She remembered laughter, not the kind given in court, but the kind that stole breath and bent the body. These memories did not make her smile. They made her ache. Because they were echoes, and echoes are reminders of silence. She wanted to stop the injections. The alchemists warned her. Withdrawal could kill her. Or worse, disfigure her. The body had become addicted to the gilded blood. It would not return to flesh without resistance. It would scream, collapse, rot. She nodded, and ordered the syringes destroyed. They watched her burn them, one by one. The fire turned bright, then black, then strange. The smoke shimmered with metal. The scent made courtiers weep. The queen stood over it all, wrapped not in velvet but in linen, her hands trembling, her eyes clear. She had made her decision. Not to die. To change. And change, for someone who has denied it for a lifetime, is a kind of death. She retreated from the court, not into her chambers, into herself. She sat in silence. She wrote letters to no one in particular, apologies to people long dead, love notes to her younger self, confessions she had never dared speak aloud, and then she burned those too, not in shame and ceremony, because the woman who had injected gold into her veins was gone, and the one who remained had no need for witnesses, only mirrors, real ones, cracked ones that reflected not a goddess, not a legend, but a woman who had made a terrible mistake and had dared finally to face it. One morning she walked through the city alone. No guards, no crown, no makeup. The people stared, but not in awe, in recognition. She was no longer untouchable. She was no longer perfect. She was something far more dangerous, relatable. And they did not bow. They nodded. And she nodded back. And in that moment, surrounded by a world she had tried to escape and was now trying to rejoin, she felt something she had not felt since the very beginning. Alive. Not preserved. Not praised. Just alive. And that was enough. For the first time, it was enough. Her transformation did not go unnoticed. The courtiers changed first, not by command, but by contagion. When perfection abandons its throne, those who worshipped it are left to reckon with themselves. They no longer painted their faces with powdered light. They no longer stiffened their necks to mimic her poise. They began, slowly, awkwardly, tenderly, to breathe. Some wept, not knowing why. Others, who had spent years competing to appear unchanging, now stood in the sun and let it kiss their skin, even if it revealed lines they had hidden. The palace softened. Its voice shifted. It no longer echoed her silence. It echoed her awakening. The marble floors, once scrubbed so fiercely they burned with glare, now welcomed dust in corners and the soft patter of bare feet. The mirrors that lined the hallways, those that had once terrified servants into submission with the image of the queen's flawless silhouette, were covered not out of shame, but to give the eyes a break from judgment. Art changed, too. Where once portraits were painted to defy age, now they bloomed with imperfection. Wrinkles were brushed with reverence. Fatigue was painted as grace. Smiles were no longer measured by symmetry, but by the way they reached the eyes. And the queen, no longer posed in immortal stillness, was depicted walking barefoot through the garden with dirt beneath her nails, and wind pulling her hair wild across her cheeks. She saw the portrait and smiled, a real one, and wept, because for the first time in decades she did not recognize the woman in the painting, and yet she believed her. That belief rippled outward, beyond the palace, through the stone veins of the city, across the hills and valleys that once offered their taxes, to a goddess who never aged. The people watched her fade, not into death, but into honesty. They saw her hair, now gray at the roots, her hands still trembling, Her eyes no longer sharp like glass, but soft, tired, deep. They saw themselves, and what they saw frightened them, because it was not just her myth they had inherited. It was her fear, her defiance, her need to be more than mortal. And now, stripped of its glow, they saw the cost. They looked inward and discovered how much of their lives had been built around an impossible woman, a woman who no longer existed. The apothecaries stopped selling gold. Not by royal decree, by shame. No one wanted it anymore. No one wanted to shine like her. They wanted to heal like her, to fail like her, to age like her. Because in her aging she had done something no alchemist ever could. She had turned fear into freedom. But transformation, once begun, cannot be undone. Her body rebelled, not violently, quietly. The gold, starved of its ritual, began to leak from her. Her skin, once untouchable, now bruised with strange patterns. Her breath, once ornamental, now labored with every hour. She spent more time in bed, not by choice, but by need. And yet she did not retreat. She invited visitors. She touched their hands. She listened to their stories. She asked children to sing. She allowed the old to scold her. And she laughed. With cracked lips and watery eyes, she laughed until her bones ached from the remembering. Her doctors offered her new treatments. Unrelated to gold, clean, modern, precise. She refused them all. Not out of pride, out of peace. She told them, "I do not need more time. I only need the time I have to matter." And so they gave her space. And in that space, something strange happened. People began to gather, not in worship, in community. Poets read verses not to please her, but to grieve the world they once shared with her. Mothers brought their children, not to ask for blessing, but to tell them, "She is why you are allowed to grow old." Men brought offerings of stories, not gold. Artists left portraits not of her face, but of moments. Her walking through rain, her holding a child's hand, her laughing at a poorly told joke. She became folklore, not for her beauty, for her courage to destroy it. One evening she sat in her garden, surrounded by a small circle of strangers, farmers, musicians, healers, no guards, no titles, just people. She told them how she once feared silence, how she once thought imperfection meant failure. She told them how the gold felt inside her veins, warm at first, like love, then cold, like revenge. And they listened, and they cried. And when the stars appeared, one of the women in the circle asked her, "Do you miss who you were?" The queen looked up, past the constellations, into the endless dark, and said, "I miss who I could have been if I hadn't tried to be eternal." And in that moment, the earth beneath her feet did something sacred. It held her, not as a monument, as a mother. And the queen, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to lean. She leaned into the soil, into the sound of the wind, into the chorus of breath around her. And though she did not yet die, she finally rested, not in fear, not in flight, not in stone, in softness. And the people, once afraid of her immortality, now gathered to preserve something far more precious, her humanity. She died on a morning that felt like any other. No eclipse marked it. No statues cracked. No thunder split the skies. Just light. Quiet, golden light. Ironic, almost tender, crawling through the windows she once sealed shut. It kissed the folds of her linen robe. It touched her hair, now fully gray. It lingered on her hands, curled gently over her chest like petals fallen from an exhausted tree. She died not as a queen. She died as a woman who had lived far longer than her body was ever meant to carry. Her final breath was not witnessed by courtiers or doctors or prophets. It was witnessed by the same servant girl, now grown, who had once whispered, "You feel cold." She did not cry. She simply placed her hand over the queen's cooling skin and whispered, "You're warm now." And for the first time, that warmth did not come from alchemy or myth. It came from surrender. The queen's body was not laid in marble. No golden casket, no death mask. She had ordered otherwise. Her final wishes were scrawled on parchment with trembling ink. "Let me return. Let me decay. Let me give back what I tried to steal." She was buried beneath the same tree she used to sit under barefoot, the one whose roots cracked stone, the one whose leaves never grew symmetrically, the one she had once watched with disdain, now chosen as the place where she would become soil again. Her funeral was not attended by royalty. It was attended by those who aged with her. Mothers, children, bakers, scribes, women with crow's feet, men with hunched shoulders, people who wore no gold, but brought her offerings of earth, bread, flowers, sweat, breath. No one spoke of her beauty. They spoke of her return. They spoke of the moment she stepped out from her throne of preservation and into the garden of loss and letting go. And in that letting go, she changed them. The kingdom did not erase her story. It rewrote it. She was no longer the immortal monarch with golden blood. She was the queen who chose to undo herself. Statues were not destroyed. They were recontextualized. Beside each one was placed a plaque, not of iron or brass, but wood, carved by hand. Each bore a different truth. Perfection is a lonely god. Immortality is the slowest kind of death. To be real is to disappear. Decay is the sincerest form of honesty. She stopped glowing, and that's when we saw her. Children were told her story not as legend, but as warning. Not to fear age, not to resist change, not to idolize stillness, but to live fully, messily, briefly, honestly. Art shifted again. Portraits no longer aimed for smoothness. They celebrated the interruptions, scars, laugh lines, gaps in teeth, paintings of elders laughing mid-cough, sculptures of women in a mid-dance, hips wide, chests lifted, eyes unashamed, and in every brushstroke, every line etched into marble, there was her shadow, not watching, not judging, just present, because her myth had not died. It had transformed. And so had the kingdom. You could feel it in the streets, the way people looked at each other longer, the way mirrors were no longer feared, the way children weren't taught to chase the sun, but to stand in it, even if it burned, especially if it burned. And at night, in the deepest parts of the palace where her chamber once stood, some swore they heard a faint sound, not footsteps, not whispers, breathing, slow, human, free, as if the walls themselves were exhaling the ghost of eternity, letting it go, letting her go, not in grief, in gratitude, because in the end, she did not defeat death. She redeemed it, and in doing so, she did something even gods could not. She made mortality beautiful again.